In today's video, I'm going to walk you through my process of how I take a boiled linseed oil up a notch using quadruplet steel wool and a technique called burnishing. Now, I love boiled linseed oil. I like idiot-proof finishes. Yes, I will, in other cases, use film finishes depending upon whether I want a specific look or protection. But for the majority of things I make, boiled linseed oil is my favorite. It's so easy to apply. It's so easy to clean up. It's very forgiving in how it's applied, and it's not easy to screw up. However, one thing boiled linseed oil lacks is that kind of hard sheen that you get from a film finish, a lacquer, something like that. It provides a deep warm color, but it doesn't have a brightness to it when you move around from different angles. And I've found that this technique provides the best of both worlds while being relatively simple at the same time. Now, the process of burnishing essentially requires you to take some hard or very lightly abrasive object, or in this case quadruplet steel wool, and apply pressure and rub out the wood using heat, and that pressure, it creates a harder surface with a nice sheen. Before chemical finishes, this was often used, we're talking a long time ago, in furniture, along with waxes and all kinds of other stuff. However, this helps us kind of skip some of the long steps that those finishers, the greats of those days, took. Now, most people in the DIY kind of hobby space will only sand up to about 220. That's their final finishing grit. And that's totally fine if you're applying a film finish. Sometimes that's even too high. Some film finishes need a rougher surface to stick. This method is only for boiled linseed oil or no finish whatsoever. You can do a burnishing only finish. Don't do this if you're doing a lacquer, shellac, polyurethane, any of that. This isn't for Danish oil, anything that builds up over time, a film finish. Yes, you can absolutely build up layers of boiled linseed oil, but it takes a long time and it still doesn't quite give that sheen that you can get with burnishing. Now, I assume most people are like myself and we don't follow the traditional method of boiled linseed oil. A coat a day for a week, a coat a week for a month, a coat a month for a year, once a year after that. It takes a long time. Boiled linseed oil, even though it's sped up the drying process using certain chemicals and solvents, it still takes a while. You can't put the furniture in your house and continue to do that. You need a space to dry, etc., etc. Most people, like myself, it's 2 coats, one on the first day, one a day or 2 later, and then once a year after that. And that works perfectly fine. You get that beautiful, deep, rich look from the boiled linseed oil. It brings out the figure, but on its own, it just doesn't have a sheen. It especially does not create a sheen on end grain. And if you have a piece where the end grain is going to be seen, this allows you to get a glass-like finish, that lacquery finish on not only the face grain and the edge grain, but on the end grain too. So I'm going to walk you through and I'm going to show you examples of up to 220 and then as well as the burnished side with the quadruplet steel wool. And hopefully I'll be able to capture with this camera in this light the difference because it's really night and day. Now, I want to get this out of the way early. If you are good with hand planes, yes, you will get the best finish if you just hand plane the wood with a smoother, if you're really good at it, and if your project is a shape and a curve or whatever that allows for it to be hand planed easily, it's going to be better than burnishing. I'll accept that. I'll admit that. That's totally fine. I'm not great with hand planes. I use them for material removal. I'm not great at them with smoothing and finishing and all of that. And so this is my way to cheat my way there, essentially. So I'm just using quadruplet steel wool from the Home Center. Home Depot is where I get mine, and I'm using the basic boiled linseed oil from the Home Center as well. These are the most basic level things. And then for the sandpaper, it doesn't really matter what you use. I'm using the Cubitron whatever from 3M, but that doesn't really matter. Sandpaper of any decent quality will get you the same kind of finish. So we're going to go 220 versus quadruplet steel wool. So the woods we're going to use are cherry, poplar, maple, oak, walnut. And the burnishing with the steel wool is used on all of these. I use it on all of these, but there are some downsides when you're using some more open pored woods because the quadruplet steel wool can eventually get brittle and break off, and you can get it stuck in some of the pores that you have to then get some tweezers and pick it out. So it's definitely able to be done with all of these, but you got to be a little more careful with the more open pored, open grained woods. Now for the burnishing, I still move through all of the grits. So I go 150, assuming it's not needing 60 grit or 80 grit, 150, 180, sometimes skip right to 220. Then I do a light 320, 400, and then the burnishing with the steel wool. You can probably skip right from the 220 to the burnishing, but it's going to take you longer with the burnishing to get out any remaining 220 scratches. I like to spend less time with each level and have slightly more levels so that I don't have to sit there and go to get out a 220 scratch with the burnishing. Starting with 150. Next up is 180. Now I don't spend a ton of time with 180. 150 and 220, then to 400 and the quadruple aught steel wool are my main that's where I'm going to spend my time getting everything out that I can. This is just to give me a boost, and the 320 is just to give me a boost, which is why I said you can skip them if you don't want to buy them. Now, in between each sanding, either wipe down or I just use compressed air, get all the dust off of there, but especially any of the leftover grit. It's really important we're not creating older scratches with a lower grit as we move up the grit. Now that the 180 is done, it's time to move on to 220. Now, 220 is where I spend probably the most of my time because it's the last chance to really get out any remaining scratches from the lower grits before we start getting to something higher that's going to take forever to remove a 150 or 180 scratch. I'll often even start by hand and go over the whole thing. And this is a great time I have a headlamp that I like to use so I can see from different angles because scratches and grit scratches will show up in light from different angles. And it's very easy to miss something early on. And then later when you're down to burnishing, you see it all of a sudden and you got to go all the way back because it may be a 180 scratch and you didn't get it out earlier. So take your time when you're at 220 and make sure it is fully cleaned of all lower grit scratches before we go on to anything higher. So I've got the 220 done. At this point, I'm not touching those that are going to be our 220 reference point. I'm going to move on, and for the ones that are going to the steel wool, I like to just briskly kind of hit them with 320. It just seems to get out any remaining 220 marks, and I'm just talking a few swipes basically. It makes it a little easier with the 400. You can skip this step and go right to the 400, but I find the 400, it takes a little while to get out a 220 mark with 400, whereas a 320 mark comes out relatively easily. So you don't go through a whole lot of it. The paper will last a while. Now, for anything I'm going to quadruple aught steel wool, I start to get very protective of that surface. I keep around some old, I don't know if this is a bed sheet or whatever, and I don't set the side that is going to be getting polished on any hard surface, anything that can scratch, especially if you're doing both sides. I keep it on something soft because once we get into these really high grits, they scratch easily. And it's a scratch you can kind of quickly get out. It's easy to get out, but it's very easy to be scratched if you were to drag it across the table. That's one of the downsides of this. So I'm going to hit 320 lightly, and then I hand sand 400. I don't pay the 400 grit mesh disc right to 400 by hand. This is just an Amazon brand sandpaper. If I remember, I'll link it below. It works really well. The 3M version of this stuff is insanely expensive, and you get barely any of it. It's ridiculous. And this works essentially as good as the 3M version. Now, when it comes to the 400 grit sandpaper and the higher grits, this stuff fills up with dust really easily, clogs up really easily. And you probably notice in a lot of my videos, I have this kind of white spot here and here. And that's because I just rub it off as I go. You can blow it out. I just rub it off and I get right back to it. I frequently blow this off too. It's just very fine dust and it clogs this up really easily, and it will start leaving kind of semi-burnishing marks, but they're marks you don't want. You want to do the burnishing with the steel wool itself. Now, these sides have all been done to 400. You can already see that we are already getting shinier compared to the 220, and we're going to now go with the quadruple aught steel wool. Now, I'll say a couple things here. You should absolutely wear a mask. This stuff gets brittle and it breaks off, and you can see it floating through the air, and you will be breathing that in. You do not want to be breathing in steel wool. Next, we also want to go with the grain here. I don't like going in circles. It just produces a smoother pattern. Sometimes when you get wild grain, it's not going to be possible to go with the grain all the time, like we've got a little crotch figure right here. But in general, go with the grain. It's okay if you go just over little spots and hyper focus all the way through at a time. This doesn't remove a whole lot of material, it removes some, but we're burnishing here. And I like to have a piece that I firmly press with, and then at the end, I like to have a piece that's lighter that I just kind of lightly go over to even out all of the spots. You're gonna feel this get hot. That's what we want. We want heat, we want rubbing, friction. We are burnishing this wood, and you'll notice it get shiny. Now, you're gonna have to have some sort of light source so you can check at different angles to make sure you've got everything, because Once you start doing this, it becomes very apparent where you haven't done it. If you have a spot where you haven't done it, you just missed it, in the right light, it's going to be very noticeable because it's going to shine everywhere else and it's going to be duller in certain places. So definitely a mask. I wear glasses too for this. I do not want this stuff. You can already see it kind of falling off here. It falls apart. It will float. Protect yourself. I'm just going to show really quickly the kind of pressure and speed that I go at here. Now, I don't do the 400 and the quadruple aught steel wool until the very end, because like I said, this can scratch relatively easily, even just minor. It's not a scratch in the same way that you've dug something out, but it's noticeable if you scratch it at all. So I wait till the very end to do this when I'm pretty darn sure I'm not going to knock it off the edge of my bench or anything else. I just want to show you already the difference between the 400 and the Burnish. The Burnish is on this side and the 400 is on this side. And you can really see in this area, we have a very smooth, shiny, and then we go over to a little rougher. Very noticeable in my opinion. And it's this step where the added time and effort comes from. And I really take my time doing this. I go at this until I can see every spot is polished evenly. I take my light at different angles. You just want to do it right the first time, and it takes a little extra effort. And that's kind of the trade-off of doing this by being able to use a boiled linseed oil-like finish to get the sheen without having to do a lacquer or some kind of spray or wipe on poly. I just wanted to show you one more time how much of this steel wool kind of breaks off due to brittleness as you go. This is all from just doing these few pieces of wood, and there was plenty of it floating in the air. So I emphasize again, wear a mask at least for this part. I wanted to go through and give you a look at just the burnishing versus the 220 now before any boiled linseed oil finish. Some people, like I said, just burnish and that's their finish. So let's look at the cherry. Burnishing on this side. Notice that sheen versus the 220. Very flat. Now, obviously, like I said, the linseed oil finish will change that, and we'll look at that later. Here is the walnut burnished on this side. I mean, just look at the color difference, and there's the sheen right there. Next up, we have the maple. This is the burnished on this side. Ignore these little bits here. That's just mineral staining from the wood, but you can see the sheen and the color slightly deeper there. Next up, we have the oak burnished on this side. See with the sheen. Now with the oak, it's going to require some just kind of careful looking over and cleanup to make sure you have nothing stuck in the grain, but it looks beautiful. Finally, here we have the poplar with the burnishing on this side. You can see that sheen to it. And then the 220 on this side, much flatter. Here is the poplar end grain that's been burnished. You can see that sheen there as well. The cherry end grain that's been burnished. Again, you can see the sheen. And then here is the maple end grain that's been burnished. I'm now going to apply the boiled linseed oil finish. Again, this is just a very basic Home Center, Home Depot brand. I'm going to apply an even amount to each one, 220 and burnishing. I'm going to flood it on 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes is usually how long I let it sit. Then I just wipe it off. I keep it flooded the entire time. If it starts sinking in, I add more to make sure it really soaks it up. I'm only going to do one coat for this demonstration. You'll be able to see the difference pretty easily. So it's been a little over 24 hours, so things are dry enough now that we can take a look. And I'm going to try to get you up close and from different angles so you can really see this. Okay, first we have the walnut. I'll let you take a look at it first. And then if it's not obvious, this one has been burnished and this one is only to 220. And these were taken from the same piece of wood. So it's not like there's two different pieces of wood here. Very noticeable difference in sheen and even in some of the color. And here is the walnut burnished up close. Again, just an incredible sheen to it. Up next, we have this hard maple. Now, as before, ignore these little marks here. This is mineral staining. So we can see, actually, there's some pretty good chatoyance from the 220 on this side, but that sheen on the left side is really nice. You can see them when you get that movement and you're kind of moving around the object, that grain really stands out. There it is. And then here's a really close look at the maple. You can see that sheen right there. And the end grain has been done as well. Let's see if we can find some light. There it is. You can see the sheen on that end grain right there. And here is the oak. You can see that burnish sheen on this side here. However, you'll notice here I clearly didn't do a good enough job. Well, you may be able to see it, I'm not sure, of cleaning out this grain. There are a few little spots where you can still see the steel wool that was left over, and I should have got the tweezers out, but I was in a bit of a rush, and this is just an example. It's a little more work on really open pored wood, so you know, really make your determination with these whether you want to do it or not if you're working on oak, especially something large. And here is the cherry. There you can see the burnished side versus the 220 side. Again, the 220 in oil, it still looks great. The oil really brings out a great color, but you don't get that incredible sheen. On top there, I did both of these sides. You can just see how beautiful that is. And then we have the cherry end grain here. You can just, it's so smooth. I can't really show how smooth something is, but it's incredibly smooth. And then the final one we have here is the poplar. There is the burnished side, and there is the 220 side. Not great on the 220 side there, just very flat, very dull, versus the burnished. Very shiny. There is the end grain right there. Incredibly smooth, very shiny. And that's going to do it for us today. There's my pitch for why you might want to consider burnishing using quadrupole steel wool on a boiled linseed oil finish. I think the results speak for themselves. Now, I know not everybody wants a sheen on every project. There's a reason satin finishes exist. This does not provide any extra protection. It does not provide anything other than just a higher sheen, okay? So I don't want people to think that this is going to somehow add something other than just an aesthetic difference. Now, while it is a little easier to scratch, it's also really much easier to finish, because when you go back to hit it with some quadruple steel wool, it doesn't really remove a whole lot of the finish. Whereas if you use 220 and you scratch and you have to go back with 220, it's going to remove quite a bit of material, and you have to go and put linseed oil back on. Just a little bit of rubbing with the steel wool, and then a little dot kind of rubbed around of linseed oil and then wiped off, and it'll be good to go. So just for reference, this is a cherry box that is only a coat of boiled linseed oil on it. After doing all of my quadruple steel wool polishing, you can see the shine, the natural shine that comes off of it there. I'll just reiterate one more time, this isn't meant to be used with any of your film finishes. It's going to be too high for things like polyurethane lacquer, especially polyurethane. It needs to grip onto something, so follow the directions there. There's no need to use this on like a Danish oil where you're building up kind of a film finish over time. This is just for penetrating oils. There's no need to use this on a wax, hard wax oil. It's not going to matter there. And there are other ways to get a burnish finish or to get a sheen that doesn't involve a film finish. This is just my way. I find it cheap. It's like $7 or something for a bag of the quadruple steel wool. It's easy to find. And it just really brings out kind of a different level of a boiled linseed oil finish. So if you do want a sheen and you don't want to spend money or use any kind of aerosol or chemical wipe-ons, any of that, and you have access to some quadruple steel wool, go ahead and give this a try. As always, test it on something that isn't your final piece to make sure you like it, to make sure it works in your house, and hopefully it works out for you. Thank you. Have a good one.